hello. Welcome to In the Growth Space. My name's David McGlennon, and I'm really glad that you're here with me here today. My goal with this podcast is to share insights and stories of leaders who've been in their own growth space. And that growth space really is that place where they've left their comfort zone and they've navigated breaking through their own terror barrier into growth and expansion. And today is no exception. So we have a great guest today. Our guest today is Marissa Levin. And let me just tell you a little bit about Marissa. She is a 5-time entrepreneur and a best-selling author. She's a globally known speaker. She delivers motivation, engagement, entertainment. And the message that she brings is really grounded in her 30-year experience of being an entrepreneur. She launched her first company in 1993 after working for somebody who capped her worth at $35,000. And then using that as fuel, she grew her company called Information Experts to roughly $14 million in annual revenue before she transitioned that company to the leadership team that she had put in place. And under her leadership, Information Experts won more than 80 awards. It was named to the Inc. 5000 list of America's fastest growing companies 3 years in a row. And she won the 2010 Smart CEO GovStar Industry Star Award. She's been an Inc. magazine columnist and a regional chair of Women Presidents Organization. And I'm really excited to bring to you this conversation with Marissa Levin. So let's go ahead and get into that conversation right now. Well, hello, Marissa. I am so excited to have you here on the podcast. Welcome to In the Growth Space.
Thank you. It is such a pleasure to be here with you, David.
I've been really looking forward to this conversation. You got such an amazing growth story. And I mean, I'm sure I say that about every person that I have on the show, but I mean, really, this is really a cool story that I'm excited to share today. And I'd love to just kind of take us back to maybe the beginning of your entrepreneurial journey. Like what led you to be, a business owner and a CEO? I'd love to kind of hear that Genesis story.
Sure. I will try and give the condensed version.
Sure.
And that was over 30 years ago. So my undergraduate degree is in English with a concentration in Shakespeare. So
oh my gosh,
like I had planned to be an entrepreneur, ever since I was born. My master's degree is in organizational development and human resources consulting with a focus on instructional design. So that's kind of my educational background. Before I started my first company, I was a journalist on Capitol Hill. I learned everything there was to know about the telecom industry, and that was very valuable back in the 90s, the early 90s.
Sure.
So I was recruited away by a consulting firm that was interested in my expertise in the whole telecom market. I knew the players, I knew the regulations, I knew the technologies, I knew the legislation that was coming out. And so I had a lot of that important niche knowledge that they wanted to use to build out a consulting practice. So I went to work for this consulting firm, and it was just my first foray into the world of consulting, and I fell in love with it. I became, a very valuable resource and asset there. I put myself through graduate school, and when it came time for my review, I had been coached by a mentor on how to present a business plan and what my value was in the marketplace based on how much money I was making then, my experience, my education, and my industry. And when I turned that over to my boss during my review, he looked at me and he said, "You'll never be worth more than $34,000 to my company."
Oh my gosh.
In that moment, he capped my worth. And my mom raised me to never let anyone determine your value or your worth. So I knew in that moment.
Yeah. Yay, Mom.
And here I was so young, I was like 23, I think, 23, 24. But I knew in that moment that my earning potential and being recognized for my value was limited at that company. And so it was really in that moment that I decided to start my first company. I didn't know what that was going to look like, but I knew I didn't want to work for someone who didn't value me. And
I
that
love that.
was a big life lesson that I got early on. So I
Mm.
launched Information Experts. That was my first company. I launched it with, and this is long before LinkedIn and, Facebook and networking groups and all of those types of things. I found my first my first opportunity in the newspaper. And
Yeah.
I was looking for technical writing positions that
Oh
were
my gosh.
contractors. And I found a position by an association, and they were looking for a full-time writer. And I said to myself, I'm going to paint the picture of why I can do this work as a contractor.
Yeah.
So there's a lesson
Yes.
in there about painting the picture, which we'll talk about as
Yes.
this podcast progresses. But
Yeah.
that I knew I was going to go in there and convince them of my value in the way that would work for me. And so that's actually
Hmm.
what I did. I landed my first contract. It was a 3-month writing contract. And that is really what kind of launched my business with that $35,000 contract. Fast
Contract.
forward, to 17 years later, and we were at 13, $14 million with over 80 people, bootstrapped it. I always say
Yeah.
that building your first company is like building a plane while you're flying it. I
Yeah.
definitely had that experience, but
Oh
really
my
that's how
gosh.
I launched my first company, was being told that I wasn't worth more than 34,000,
Oh
and
my gosh.
and then going out and demonstrating my worth to my first client. And from that
Yeah.
point forward, it just kept growing in
Mm.
lots of different ways. And
Oh
so
my gosh.
that's how I launched my entrepreneurial career.
Man, I love that. There's so many great lessons in that, just from the, valuing yourself perspective and knowing what you're worth and not letting anybody else cap your worth. I think that's, such a phenomenal lesson, not only for, the young women who are listening to the
Yeah.
podcast, but young men too. And all throughout our careers, we need to know our worth and like you said, be able to paint the picture as to why we're right for something or right for a role or a business or what have you.
And on the flip side, you've got a lot of leaders and emerging leaders listening to you.
Yep.
They have to value their employees. I
Yes.
just got off a
Yes.
coaching call this morning with an executive who works for a large company, and his associate that supports him is up for review, and they're at a $5,000 difference in terms of what her raise may be.
Uh-huh.
And she may very well leave if upper leadership and management does not approve that $5,000. That's going to be the most expensive $5,000 that they will experience,
Yes.
right? So
Yes.
we also have to encourage the people that work for us to
Mm-hmm.
value their own worth, and we have to
Right.
demonstrate that we value them. So
Yes. Yes.
there's a lesson in there too.
Yeah, wow, there sure is, sure is. I'm kind of curious about your growth path from the business perspective. Going from just a startup to what I think you said $13 million in a really short period of time. So what was that like for you? And like, what were those inflection points maybe from the growth path of going from your first contract to
Yeah.
each I don't know, there's probably certain mileposts that might stick out in your mind as to like what did it feel like, what was it like in that growth journey?
So there are so many lessons. So, when someone starts a company, if they're starting, as just a solopreneur,
Mm-hmm.
they are going to, if they end up growing the business, they're going to move from practitioner to manager to leader. It's
Yeah.
a natural trajectory. And they're going to go from being a small fish in a small pond to a big fish in a small pond
Mm-hmm.
to a small fish in a larger pond to a
Yeah.
bigger fish in a larger pond. And ultimately, if you keep growing, to the ocean, right?
Yeah.
That is just the natural trajectory. And a lot of times entrepreneurs start businesses because they have a passion, right? And they want to they
Yeah.
want to monetize, they want to profitize their passion. They want to take their
Yeah.
purpose and their passion and they want to profitize it. And that's wonderful,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
they're really passionate about it. They're going to be selling the work, they're going to be doing the work, and all of that is wonderful if you're creating a hero-centric organization, right? Like you build an
Mm-hmm.
organization around yourself If you know that you're going to be building a lifestyle organization, there's no problem with that. But
Right.
you're only as valuable as the amount of time that you're choosing to work, right? And that's usually
Yeah.
how we start.
Sure.
That's often what happens, right? But if you're going to scale, you've got to be okay with making those first hires. And I
Mm-hmm.
want to just backtrack and say, even back then when I had no business experience at all, and I hadn't taken any courses or anything like that, intrinsically, I knew that the first thing that I had to do when I started my business was build the foundation on my values, mission, and vision. Period.
Sure.
Like
Yes.
it's
Yes.
got to be the first thing that you do. You have to know what you stand for. You have to know what your your north compass is. You have to know what your
Yeah.
moral compass is, right? Your North
Yeah.
Star. You have to have that values centric direction because that's
Mm-hmm.
going to help you determine who you hire, who you
Sure.
fire, who you work with, who you align with as a partner,
Yep.
all of that, what vendors you work with, your values have to be the number one thing that
Mm-hmm.
drive you because they're going to create your culture. And my second
Yeah.
company was called Successful Culture International. So I know a thing or two about culture.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
have to develop your mission and your vision, right? Why you
Mm-hmm.
exist and what the impact is in the world. It's no one else's job to do that. You have to do that in order to attract and create the business that you want to build.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're starting out, those are really the foundational building blocks. And
Mm-hmm.
just know that your first hire, when you're an entrepreneur, you're going to go back to those values, mission, and vision, and you're going to use those as the framework, right? So, like when I started my
Yeah.
company, Information Experts, what mattered to me, and a lot of times what we choose to do reflects what I call contrast. It reflects situations and experiences that we don't want to repeat, right?
Yeah.
so
Right.
so part of the reason I started my business is because I wasn't treated well where I worked.
Sure.
I wasn't valued. There were situations that happened there that challenged both my physical and my psychological safety. And
Mm-hmm.
so I knew when I created an organization, I knew that I wanted to create something that was based on a three-pronged approach to quality of products and services, quality of life inside the company, and quality of life outside the company. And
Yeah.
so that
Love
three-pronged
it.
approach to quality led me to making my first hire of a director of quality control.
Ah,
That was
wow.
my very
Interesting.
first
Yeah.
hire in my first company. And
Wow.
so our values really drive that. So I think that's a really important lesson for the leaders who are listening to
Yeah.
be reminded that, regardless of where you are in your path of leadership, always come back to the core values.
Mm-hmm.
Always. Like when you're
Yes.
hiring, when you're promoting, when you're firing, when you're people putting on if you're putting people on PIPs, performance improvement programs,
Yep.
all of it comes back to the values. And
Mm-hmm.
so when I built my company, that really initially, we were in the commercial space and we were in the telecom market and the internet market. And I lived through the whole implosion of the whole telecom and internet market and the collapse of the stock market and all of that. And lesson number two that I think it's important for your listeners to know is that you have to be ready to pivot in any moment, because if you can't
Yeah.
pivot, you're going to go out of business. It doesn't matter how
Yeah.
your products and services are. If you're not relevant in the market, you're going to go out of business. And so
Yeah.
we had to pivot from a market perspective of being all commercial and being very industry specific. We decided to pivot and go into other industries. And then 9/11 happened. And
Yeah.
so we then went into the government space. And that's how we got
Okay.
into the federal market. And
Got it.
there's a whole story about what all of that looked like and how we moved there, because commercial versus federal are two totally different universes and different animals.
Mm-hmm.
Commercial market, you lead with value and follow with price. Government, you lead with price and follow
Price.
with value. Different types of,
Yeah.
business development, different types of solutions, all of that.
Sure.
So there's so much to think about. But if you're not pivoting, if you don't always have that mindset of I'm in constant evolution, then you're going
Yeah.
to be stagnant and you're going to go backwards. So
Gosh.
we
Yeah.
yeah, we
Ah,
pivoted
that's so
that
good.
company probably 7 times in under the
Yeah.
17 years that I was leading it. Major,
Yeah.
major pivots in order to stay relevant.
Well, you must have had to have some really adaptable people to be able to do that. I think of, I think when people hear the word pivot, right now, as we're recording this, I mean, obviously we're 4 years past the pandemic, but in that moment, there were a lot of companies that had to pivot and adapt.
Yeah.
But what you're sharing is like, most companies have pivoted, have adapted, and have been creative throughout their, history. You're talking about multiple pivots. How did you find leaders that were really adaptable in those moments? I'm so curious about that.
So one of our values was flexibility. So it
Okay,
gets back
so
to the core value.
perfect.
But if you do
Yeah.
not pivot, you're going to go out of business. We
Yeah.
had a scenario in our company. We were a training and development company,
Hmm.
and it used to be, people will find this hard to believe, our younger listeners here, that
Sure.
the only type of training that existed was classroom-based training.
You're right.
There was nothing
Right.
online, right? It was
Yeah.
all
No Zooms.
instructor-led. So guess what that meant? You were designing and developing binders, right? Binders
Yes. Oh
of
yeah.
participant guides and
Oh my
instructor
gosh.
guides, and you were you were like FedExing them or like shipping them to a room where people were gathering, and they had these giant binders, and like
Yep.
that was the model for training.
Right. Right.
Until John Chambers, who was the CEO of Cisco at the time, announced one day that e-learning would be the quote unquote killer application of the internet. And literally overnight, just like that, my industry shifted. And if I wouldn't have
Mm.
shifted, I would have gone out of business. So it's
Yeah.
not about where can you find leaders that are flexible. It's about turning on a dime.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
what we had to do, I employed wonderful instructional designers. That's what my master's degree was in. We
Yeah.
were a rock star ISD organization. Overnight, I had to look at the landscape and what we were going to have to pivot to and say, my skill sets are changing. Like my instructional designers, they're not
Hmm.
programmers. And back then, nothing was
Yeah.
intuitive. Everything was complicated from a
Sure.
programming perspective. So
Yeah.
I couldn't force a round peg into a square hole. I couldn't say I'm going to
Hmm.
turn my instructional designers into multimedia developers. Like
Yeah.
there was um, the skill sets and the experiences of the job. It was really two job functions. It was you, the instructional designer, stay over here and design the instructional design plan and the storyboards and the treatments and the content, and then you're going to turn them over to this
Mm.
multimedia developer, and he's gonna or she's gonna program it, right?
Hmm.
Today, everything is intuitive, and your
Yeah.
instructional designer can create beautiful courses online and all of that, but that's
Sure.
not how it worked at all.
Yeah.
And so I
Yeah.
had to look at my team and say, where are the skill sets, and how do I adapt this? How do I
Hmm.
supplement my existing team so that I
Yeah.
don't go out of business? We had to change our whole business model in order to stay relevant. And
Yeah.
it's
It's
not
amazing.
like it's not a luxury. Like there's no
Right.
when there's a change. So the whole training industry went from in one day went from being like all instructor led, the pendulum swung all the way to all of a sudden everybody wanted everything online. We
Hmm.
all know that everything swings back to the middle and there's a balance, but you
Yeah.
have to follow that pendulum in order to stay relevant. And that's what we had to
Yeah.
do.
Yeah. Well, and I think if I'm just kind of encapsulating what I'm hearing you share in your story, if I could give any message to not only our emerging leaders, but the advancing leaders and senior leaders who are listening, it's really that you have to adapt. You have to be willing to change and not get stuck in the status quo. And quite frankly, that means you got to get outside of your comfort zone and do things that you've never done. You referenced, building an airplane while you're flying it.
Yeah.
And, it's really true. It's like, hey, how are we going to add another engine on the other wing, while you're trying to kind of keep the yaw from, taking you one way. And, so I really appreciate that. And I think that most leaders know that, but that's not always the comfortable thing to do. And so it couldn't have been much comfort, as you're going through it. I'm sure it was really difficult.
It was. And, with a lot of I coached leaders. I've coached hundreds and hundreds of CEOs in my career, through the current business that I have now, as well as the business that we sold. And what I teach my clients is that, change is on a continuum, right? In terms of
Yeah.
the comfort, like how we all
Yeah.
think about change.
Yes.
And on one side of the continuum, you've got the people who are going to be camping out at Best Buy to get like that, or the Apple Store, to get that newest
New
release
thing.
the
Yeah.
minute that it comes out, right? Like they'll
Right.
brave, sub freezing temperatures so that they can be the early adopter. And then
Yep.
you've got people who are on the other side of the change continuum, and those people are like holding on to their obsolete model for dear
Right.
life. Like they would still have a phone plugged into the wall if they could, right?
Right. With a rotary dial, right?
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
Most of us are somewhere in the middle,
Yeah.
and it's important for us to have that self-awareness in terms of how
Mm-hmm.
comfortable we are with change, and to know where
Yes.
our people are in terms of
Mm-hmm.
their comfort level with change, which is why change
Mm.
management strategies are so key when companies are going
Yeah.
through shifts and evolutions and
Mm-hmm.
transformations, that you as a leader are dialed into the fact that there is a continuum of change, and that
Yeah.
everybody on your company is somewhere. And I've
In
led,
that. Yeah.
I'm a VP of culture and leadership for a medical practice in New York. I'm a
Okay.
fractional, C-suite leader there.
Yeah.
They're going through massive change. And so I coached one of the leaders to do an exercise with her team where they actually plotted out, like, here's the continuum of change. Here's where I am as the leader. Like, I'm not that comfortable with change, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
leading you through it. Where
Yeah.
are you on the continuum of change? And
Wow.
by doing it yourself as the leader, you're giving them permission to
Sure.
be vulnerable as well. And then you
Yeah.
can get a map of your organization on where the comfort level is for change.
Mm-hmm.
And it just helps people not feel isolated or overwhelmed, but
Yeah.
feel seen and heard and understood. And so
Yeah.
just having the conversations about change, it's really, really important from a leadership perspective.
Man, I'm so glad that you said that and shared that, because one of my questions that popped up for me was like, how did you bring people being at variety of points on
Yeah.
that change continuum? How'd you bring them along? Because I know that from a leadership perspective, that's really difficult. And I think really what you shared is that, being able to be vulnerable and say, hey, here's where I am. And even if you're on the extreme end, being able to say, hey, here's where I am, but I know that a lot of you are in different places, and that's okay. Where are you? And that exercise is really, really important, I think. And recognizing that people are at different places is important as well.
Well, and I think, that just lends itself to a leader being super intentional in creating the space within their organization to express, to
Mm-hmm.
have two-way dialogue, right? Like
Yeah.
whenever you can look for that opportunity to invite and encourage your employees to join the conversation. And
Mm.
I'll share a couple of examples of how we've done that, or how I did it,
Love it.
when I had my company. Uh,
Yeah.
Whenever you can find those opportunities to invite them and enroll them in the conversation, you're going to
Mm.
increase engagement, right?
Yeah.
So, like one of the things that I did when I was running my company, all companies like to have all hands meetings, right?
Sure. Yeah.
To the CEO likes to stand up there every quarter and give a state of the company address, and like,
Mm-hmm.
here's our new customers, and here's our profits, and here's the things we're working on, and here's the things we're rolling out, and here are our new hires, and state of the company, right? And
Yeah.
typically how that goes is that the CEO creates a nice PowerPoint deck. People come into a conference room. It usually goes from like 9 to 11 or 10 to 12, right? And at the very end, the CEO says, anyone have any questions?
Questions. Yeah.
And no
Right.
one says anything for two
Right.
reasons. First, they don't feel comfortable. And secondly, they know that they are what is in between this meeting and lunch, right? And
Yep.
so
Yep.
no one wants to be that employee that is
Right.
stopping lunch, right? And this
Right.
happens on virtual too. Like,
Sure.
people might not feel safe about contributing. And so what we would do, instead of having all hands meetings, I had what was called a town hall meeting. And
Sure. Sure.
I would send out an anonymous survey, ahead of the meeting, and I would say, what am I not seeing? What am I missing? What is it that we need to be talking about? What are your agenda items? What problems are we having? Like, what suggestions do you have? Because the most important vantage point of your company is your employees' perspectives, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
leaders are up here at the 50,000-foot level. Like, that's where we have to be. Your employees are the one who's executing your vision all day long. Like, they're seeing things from their perspective, right? And so you won't get their perspective unless you create the space
Safe space.
and the container for them to contribute what they're seeing. So we allow them to send in information and ideas anonymously, with the understanding that we're going to read every single thing that you send in. We may not address every single one. We will address it privately, after, if we don't get to you. But know that you are heard, and we're going to work in as much as we possibly can in advance. And so creating that opportunity for the two-way communication is really, really important at any time that you can in an organization.
Wow, what a great way to create, so there's so much talk about engagement right now, and how there's a lack of engagement. And I think that if more leaders would put into place a process like you just explained about allowing people to contribute and to be heard, they're going to feel like they're actually contributing and really making a difference. And so having that two-way conversation is so important.
Yeah. And I know you're reading my book.
I am, yes. Built to Scale, yes.
So the only book out there on how to build advisory boards. It's the scale model, how you select, compensate, associate, leverage, and then evaluate, evolve, and exit. Building an advisory board is one of the most important strategic initiatives that any business owner can do. It also injects a lot of change into the organization. So again, when companies embark on this initiative to build an advisory board, the communication has to be really, really transparent, because if your people think you're interviewing different executives, they're going to create a story, right? Either like, who's being fired, right? We have other executives joining. Are we being acquired? Like, they're going to create stories. And so this is why it's so important in every initiative, no matter what the change is, whether it's something super small, like a change to your health insurance, or something big, like putting in an advisory board or bringing in a new executive, whatever the change is, they're going to create their own conclusions, no matter what. So we as the leader have to take a proactive approach to circumventing that and be very transparent with what's happening.
Yeah, for sure. So think for a moment, for just a second, we've been talking a lot about like the senior leaders and how they need to act. How might an emerging leader, interact in this kind of environment? How should an emerging leader, create the story or be able to, engage with that senior leadership and with those maybe other employees who they might be hearing stories like that? Because I think that's really an important thing for those emerging leaders to learn and to develop the ability to kind of act in a different way and kind of create an elevation in their own leadership. Any thoughts on that?
Well, that's a really broad question. I think it's
I know.
company to company, right? Because every culture is different. So is that emerging leader, are they empowered to lead, even as an emerging leader? Like, how much autonomy do they have? How much agency do they have to lead and direct conversations? If I'm trying to bring up a level of emerging leaders into my organization, which is kind of like, succession planning or, just kind of grooming the next generation of leaders, I'm going to want to make sure that there is some sort of mentorship program in place, or just that the culture encourages individual thinking, because there's a big difference between management and leadership, right?
100%, yes.
Like an emerging leader is not someone that should be managed. An emerging
Right.
leader is someone that needs to be led and is encouraged to do their own critical thinking and solution
Yes.
brainstorming rather than being
Yes.
told what to do. So in my
Mm-hmm.
role as the VP of Culture and Leadership for this company, as I grow these leaders, and they're all emerging leaders, I'm always encouraging them that when they're giving feedback to their team members, rather than directing them, right, or instructing them, ask questions.
Yeah.
Again,
Yeah.
encourage the critical thinking, right? What would you
Mm-hmm.
have done differently in this situation rather than saying, here's how, next
Yeah.
time, this is what I would suggest, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
ask questions. We're both a member
Mm-hmm.
of Exchange. Like we know that
Yes.
questions, they are the lifeblood
Yeah.
of critical thinking, and they're the lifeblood of an
100%.
organization and those important conversations. So
Yeah.
I would hope that leaders who are investing in emerging leaders would create a culture where people felt safe to make mistakes, take risks, lead
Yeah.
conversations,
Yeah. Yeah.
challenge the status quo, all in the framework of what the values, the mission, and the vision are.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that perspective so much because, I've often shared that, just that handoff in my own personal life was like abrupt. And I know that like you used the word succession planning, and I want to go down that route for just a second because I think there's a lot of leaders thinking about that, especially from a senior leadership. There's a lot of people in the baby boomer era and the Gen X era that are thinking about moving on or what their next act is.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, I think every leader needs to be thinking about who do they bring up, kind of behind them or as they advance and as they grow, how do they bring someone else up and along as well? How did you think about succession planning in your business? I'm just kind of curious from your perspective, like how did you think about that?
So with my first company, as I share with you, after the 16 or 17-year mark, after a long series of events, I decided that I was no longer the right CEO for that company. And
Mm,
just from a frame of reference, the average tenure for CEOs is 7 years. So I
yeah,
lasted a long
a
time
long time. Yeah,
past
sure.
that. There were things
Yeah.
that happened that were just huge clues that I was no longer the right leader. The main one being that our primary client was the government, and we went through the something that was called the lowest price technically acceptable mandate. That was enacted by the Obama administration.
Okay.
And basically, what it did is it's exactly what it sounds like. You were a vendor for the government, and you were selected if you were the lowest price. Like that was it.
Okay.
Like
That was it. That was the sole criteria, huh?
yeah, and
Okay.
overnight, we went from having a customer that valued innovation and valued high value and valued transformational services to being a
Mm-hmm.
customer who really only cared about price and transaction. And so when you
Yeah.
built a company and a culture around not being the lowest price,
Yeah.
and which is what we did. That meant we paid our people well. We had high value people. Like that's why
Sure.
we were such a creative powerhouse, right? And
Yeah,
by our
sure.
culture, we were able to invest in our people. When your
Mm,
largest company changes its values, for me as the business owner, that was what I call a psychological bloodbath because I had given my
but
whole life to my
yes.
company to build this culture, and culture was everything to me. And
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden I couldn't afford my people because
Yeah.
it was a horrible place to be.
I can
So,
imagine.
I've written a lot when I used to write for Inc. magazine, and I've written a lot about the Peter Principle.
Mm.
And for your listeners who aren't aware of what that is basically when you promote someone to their highest level of incompetence, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you want to reward loyalty, you want to reward longevity, right? You want to
Yep.
reward performance. What
Mm.
do? You promote them.
Promote them. Yeah.
But what happens is as you promote them up the chain, the skill sets and attributes and desires and personality traits required to do that job don't align with what they were initially hired, where they're excelling,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
Right.
so what I learned from my own experience is that the Peter Principle applies to the C-suite too. And
Yeah.
it's
Interesting.
really important for a CEO to critically evaluate themselves and say, am I in fact the right person to run this company anymore? And
Mm-hmm.
I was at that place.
Wow.
It's a really hard place to be. And
I can't even
you know,
imagine. Yeah.
the last day of my tenure, I submitted my own letter of resignation. I had to put someone in my place. And
Yeah.
one of my
Wow.
core advisors said to me, you do it, you submit it, you don't take any more money from that company, you walk out and you don't look back. And that's what I
Yeah.
did. So
Wow.
yeah,
That was difficult.
it
What a
was.
difficult. I can't even imagine that, a company that you've built and
Yeah,
you've brought up to, that multiple $1 million revenue
yeah.
stage and then stepping back. So up until that point though, had you been grooming somebody internally, or did you look for a CEO outside of the
We had an
organization?
executive team, and so
Okay.
it just was clear,
Who was right for?
it was clear. I mean,
Yeah.
by the end, I mean, I can remember being on an all hands call that was being run, a phone call by one of the other executives, and I remember him saying to me, "Don't speak." My own company, and it was in that moment that I was
Wow.
like, "It's time for me to go."
It's time for me to go. Yeah.
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 So, you know, we don't have time to get into the spiritual path because that
Yeah,
I'm a
sure.
very deep spiritual path, but
Yeah, yeah.
in that moment, and this is going back almost, 15 years ago, I remember saying to myself, save my business or save my soul. I have to make a choice, right?
Sure,
And
sure.
so I was like, I can always build another business. I have one soul. And so I left
Yeah.
and I launched my next business and built that
Yeah.
one, which we sold. My partner and I sold about 18 months ago. So
Okay.
December
Okay.
of 2022. So yeah, it was a pretty
Yeah.
evolutionary journey.
Yeah, it sounds like it, man. That's just so fascinating to me. So let me ask this. So as you think about, like, you started another company that you just talked about, you
Hmm.
just sold.
Hmm.
How did you think about like planning your next? I'll call it your next act, or so that company, or even like now. How are you thinking about like what's next?
Yeah,
Because I know there's a lot of leaders out there kind of thinking that same thing, and also, and maybe this, I probably wrapped too many questions into this, but my curiosity like takes me down this path. Like, how did you unwrap your identity? If your identity was in that business, how did you unwrap that? So that's probably two different questions, but I'll
yeah,
throw them
yeah.
out
So the
there.
identity question we could definitely do a separate podcast on, but as
Okay.
we're
Yeah.
going
Sure.
through, and I
Yeah.
think I sent you the link on that podcast. I have been interviewed about that on a separate podcast. And
Yeah.
through the whole process of selling our company, my meditation practice is very deep, and I've been a practitioner of Buddhism for the last 25, 30 years. Like my
Yeah.
spiritual path is
Really deep.
very strong. And
Yeah. Yeah.
and I will tell you that selling my company and going through that process was one of the most spiritually evolutionary processes I've ever had in my life because
Yeah.
of the identity piece. I
Mm-hmm.
had one company and I had to dissolve that identity. Then I launched another company and I had to dissolve that identity and still
Mm-hmm.
remain true and connected to who I am in my soul, like in my essence. And so
Mm-hmm.
my meditation practice every single day was so critical for me to stay grounded through that
Yeah.
whole process. And then after that company was gone, again, I was left with no identity from a business perspective, right? So I had to
Right.
be sure that I was connected to who I was.
Yourself.
And
Yeah.
and when I started my second company after I left Information Experts, I was so exhausted. I was
Mm.
exhausted. So I launched a solopreneur. It was just me, right?
Yeah.
And I just needed to breathe. I just needed to
Mm.
get regrounded. And
Yeah.
I had personal things going on, two kids, my mom was ill, like all sorts of different
Mm.
things. And I just gave myself time and space to breathe and get grounded. And then when
Mm-hmm.
I felt like I wanted to build again, I brought in a partner and we were able to grow something, scalable
Yeah.
and sold that. And so, now I'm here again and I took time and went through a lot of different life transitions over the last 12 to 15 months. And now I'm back with Marissa International, which is basically going to be, a full global school of helping others step into their
Mm.
most joyful lives and highest potential. So I'm
Love
going
it.
to have three different tracks of business development, like professional growth and professional development, personal development, and then the spiritual path. And that's going to be a full
Love it.
online school offering group coaching, training,
Very cool.
masterminds, and then some one-on-one training or someone one-on-one and coaching, depending on who the client is.
Oh, I love that. Love that, Marissa. That's so great. You know what I heard you say, I think is really important. I don't want people to miss this because you kind of went by it, but you took time to kind of refresh yourself. You
I
took
did.
time to really just breathe and allow yourself some space. And man, I think in our world of, full on Mach 3 with our hair on fire kind of an attitude, there are a lot of leaders that miss that. They think that that's what they've got to do. They've got to keep moving forward and they got to keep moving fast. And
To go from
and
frying pan to fire, they feel that they
yeah,
need to do that.
yeah, it's really interesting. And I would have probably put myself in that same camp up until maybe last year, where because I took a sabbatical last year. I took 30 days off, and I in that time frame, I really saw the value of downshifting and just really slowing down a little bit. And it gave me space to think. And I think that that's what's missing from a lot of leaders' days and rhythms is the space to think. And I think that as we think about succession planning, that's what it takes. It takes thinking. It takes time and space to be able to do that. And I don't know if that was true with you, if that was something that you just had to really force yourself to do, or if because of your spiritual practices, you were in that rhythm of doing that already.
So stillness is key. I mean, I've
Hmm.
always injected stillness into my life. Truly my meditation practice has been my lifeline. So
Yeah.
I've done a lot of silent retreats, even like being in my own home with my own, my sacred
Mm,
space in my home. Stillness
sure.
has always been key. Uh, we work so hard to be human doings. We are human beings, and so
Love
it's
that.
important
Yeah.
that we do that. I will say that I wasn't comfortable with it, right? I, I've always, I mean, I've had a consistent stream of clients and work forever. I've never not had that. I mean, even with my coaching, even after I sold my other company, I still had a dozen coaching clients under another
Hmm.
LLC. But in
Hmm.
terms of building, I wasn't building. I was just serving, right?
Sure.
And
Yeah.
so what I learned last year, because I went through so many different life transitions with my kids are older. My youngest graduated grad school, moved to Raleigh, North Carolina, which
Mm,
just like ripped me apart.
I'm sure.
Like, I it's just being 4 hours away from me now. My older son is engaged and he's living in Richmond, and like he's well on his way with his life. And
Yeah.
it's a lot to process. I lost my
Sure.
dad last summer, and
Mm,
he like
yeah.
that's just normal life transition. But
Right.
what I learned is that you cannot construct while you are deconstructing.
Mm,
And
mm,
my life last year was in the process of deconstruction on a lot of different levels, from
mm-hmm,
business to personal to where I was
mm,
living, loss of
yeah.
parent, like, and so we have to give ourselves grace as humans just to be
Yeah.
able to move
Yeah.
through these things. And
Hmm,
that was such an important lesson to me, that we
yeah.
cannot construct and build and create while we are deconstructing.
Deconstructing. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's so
yeah.
good. That is so good. I can so relate to that and appreciate it at the same time as well. Marissa, this conversation is like there's so much to it that and there's so many different directions that I could go. I'm loving it. If there was like a final message that you could share with let's just call it an emerging leader. Like if you look back on your life and you think about what's maybe like one message that you would share with that emerging leader that might be listening and thinking about, well, I'm not a CEO. I'm at the beginning part of my leadership journey. What would you tell them? What advice would you give them?
So it's not even just emerging leaders, it's just humans.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I love
Um,
that.
so the most important voice that we listen to is our inner voice. It
Mm-hmm.
always has to be our inner voice,
Yeah.
our inner knowing, like we
Mm-hmm.
know. And when we feel resistance against something that we're experiencing or doing,
Yeah.
and there's even just a shred of feeling that it doesn't feel right, there's so much information and wisdom in that resistance and in that inner voice. And
Yeah.
it's really important that we listen to it. It's
Right.
really important. So I
Mm.
would definitely say that just dialing into your inner voice, your intuition, your inner knowing
Mm. That's
is
good.
one thing. And then the second thing, I mean, I know you asked me for one, but for me, my most important quote is from Gandhi, which is "My life is my message."
Mm.
Just
Yes.
to be fully aligned and not to lose sight of like who you are at your core, like in your
At your
essence,
core. Yeah.
your soul,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
for the sake of a career, for the sake of a promotion, for the
Mm-hmm.
sake of money, right? For the
Mm-hmm.
sake of
Right.
materialism, any of it, right?
Yeah.
Just be aligned, make sure there's alignment between your life and how you're living it and the
Mm-hmm.
messaging that you're communicating to the world.
I love that so much. And even as you're sharing that, I mean, it reminds me that in order to do that, we have to get quiet and
You know,
we have to hear the voice because that voice isn't loud sometimes. It's pretty quiet. We have to get tuned into it. And also we have to learn ourselves. We have to learn who we are and kind
yeah.
of begin to understand who we've been built to be and what we're made of
Mhm.
and what our core values are. So yeah, I love that so much. Gosh, Marissa, I'm sure there's going to be a part two to this
Yeah.
because there's so much. We didn't even get into your book, and I love your book because you talk about building advisory boards and scaling with advisory boards, and so we'll get into that in another episode. So hopefully you'll come back. Hopefully you'll come back for another
Absolutely. Yes.
conversation.
Yes. Thank you. Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, Marissa, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate the time and the wisdom that you shared along the way. So thanks a lot.
Such a pleasure. And thank you for creating this space so that others can learn.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure.